At the same time that we have growing epidemics of obesity and diabetes in our population, we also have a growing epidemic of mental disorders.
You can learn to be happy because happiness is ultimately a brain function.
The field will say we have tons of evidence-based treatments and people should get help for depression. And if they get help for depression, our treatments work. And, if we just got more people help, everything would be fine. And the reality is we've got dozens of different antidepressants. We have tons of different psychotherapies, psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral and all sorts of things. We've got ketamine injections. We've got electroconvulsive therapy. We've got transcranial magnetic stimulation and other things. So with all that treatment, you'd think we would be doing a pretty good job. But as you mentioned, depression is now the leading cause of disability on the planet, above all other medical diagnoses. And it's not because people aren't getting treatment, it's because our treatments fail to work for far too many people. So if you look at the initial treatment for depression, if somebody comes in off the street with their first episode of major depression and gets treatment, gold standard treatment, an antidepressant and or psychotherapy, the statistics that usually get cited are 70% will have a response rate, meaning some of their symptoms will get at least a little bit better, but only 30% will have a remission of illness, which means that they will no longer have 5 out of the 9 criteria for depression. It means they will have 4 or fewer of the symptoms of depression. So put another way, if you come in for treatment for depression and get gold standard treatment, there's a 70% chance after 6 months that you're still going to have depression. The whole thing. You're going to meet full criteria for depression. And even more people than that 70% are still going to have some lingering symptoms of depression. When researchers followed people with depression for 12 years and looked like what happens to them long term, like how many of them are really getting better and staying better, the really shocking and sad news is only 10% of people went into remission and then stayed in remission. That means 90% of people who get treatment for depression, the depression keeps coming and going, it doesn't go away, and they still have symptoms. And on average, people in that study had serious symptoms of depression more than half the time.
That is just outrageous. So we're talking 9 out of 10 people who are seeking treatment for this issue that's become so pervasive in our society. Again, you said the number one cause of disability, right? So this is above cardiovascular issues, low back pain, which is another big one. Whatever the case might be, this is the top thing today. It's depression. And our treatments are only helping successfully, really mapping things out long term, 1 out of 10 people, right? So 90% of folks are not getting adequate treatment or not really figuring out what the root cause is. And so with that being said, again, there's an appearance of innovation and of efficacy. We've got so many different things that we throw at people, but is it working? That's the question, really. And for us to just take a good look, step back, take a meta perspective, like, this is not working very well right now. We need to kind of recalibrate, but we're not really doing that. And is this a result of just kind of getting educated on what we should be doing and just kind of getting locked in and tunnel vision on treating people like this?
I think the real answer is that people don't know what to do. Well-meaning psychiatrists and neuroscientists and administrators, I think everybody on the planet kind of has a sense that we have a crisis in mental health. The rates are going up. So many people are suffering. Their lives are ruined by mental illness, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, all of it. But the answer is that people haven't been able to figure out like this really simple question: what causes mental illness? So we're just shooting in the dark. We're just trying this treatment, that treatment. We don't even know how a lot of these treatments work. We just know they kind of sort of reduce some symptoms. So we're just shooting at the dark, throwing anything we can at it. And the sad reality, as you said, is it's not working. At the same time that we have growing epidemics of obesity and diabetes in our population, those are metabolic disorders. We also have a growing epidemic of mental disorders. And it's across the board. A lot of people don't realize that. It's all of the mental disorders, essentially. It's not just anxiety and depression, but they are the most common disorders, so they're the ones that get talked about the most because they affect the most people, so that's fine. But autism has tripled in the last 20 years. If you go back to the 1970s, it's up something like 83 times. 83-fold increase. That's 8,300% fold increase, which is crazy. And if you look at bipolar disorder, the rates of bipolar disorder have doubled in adults, and they've gone through the roof in terms of children and adolescents. I mean, it's like a 40-fold increase, but that's largely because it was non-existent, like prior to the 1970s, but now it's getting commonly diagnosed. But rates of ADHD are up, rates of personality disorders are, like, everything's going up. And on the surface, everybody's scratching their head like, what is going on here? Why are all these mental disorders increasing? This can't be. It can't. So some people go into the category of, I can't even believe it. And other people are like, well, maybe we're just recognizing it more. But the researchers really doing this work are saying, no, guys, no, folks, these rates are really skyrocketing. And so when we think about metabolic health and mental health, what I'm arguing is that they are inseparable. That at the same time, a bad metabolism or a faulty metabolism or an insufficient metabolism, whatever we want to call it, a metabolic problem can make someone overweight or obese. There's no question about it. A metabolic problem can be associated with having a heart attack or a stroke. Everybody kind of knows that. But what I'm saying is metabolic problems also affect the brain. Plain and simple. In the same way that a metabolic problem can make you die of a heart attack and it can adversely affect your heart, guess what, folks? It can affect your brain too. The brain is not just immune to metabolic problems. Like, we know that metabolic problems affect the heart and the kidneys and the liver and your fat cells and all sorts of other things. Why the hell does anybody think the brain's not affected? Like, at the end of the day, it's kind of that simple.
If I was an evil ruler and I wanted to create mental illness, what would I do? I'd create American society with fast food restaurants everywhere, with food deserts, with this notion that alcohol is a health food, or marijuana is innocuous, or the news is in fact the news, because the news is not the news. The news is a marketing device for advertisers to make money, and they scare you, where millions of amazing things happened yesterday, but you never hear about them because they don't get eyeballs. Fear is a primitive response. The brain pays attention to fear first, and so they scare you. And in that way, they can sell you the medications that have this laundry list of side effects. So before the pandemic, we were at epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, ADHD, addictions, the opioid epidemic, for example. Depression was at 8.5% of the population. And then the pandemic hit. And by August of 2020, it was at 28% of the population. It had more than tripled. So not since the Great Depression has there been this level of unhappiness. And as I saw that, I'm like, but you can learn to be happy. Whatever situation you're in, you just have to know the neuroscience of it, because happiness is ultimately a brain function. And as I was tackling this, I came across a video that I just love by Dennis Prager called Why Be Happy? And in it, he says, happiness is a moral obligation. And I'm like, what? So I grew up Roman Catholic, and I went to Catholic school and Catholic high school, and I guarantee you that idea that happiness is a moral obligation was nowhere to be found, that it was about guilt and control and shame. And then it's like, so why is it a moral obligation? Because of how you impact other people. I guarantee you, and you know about this, if you're raised by an unhappy parent or married to an unhappy spouse, and you ask somebody, is happiness an ethical issue? And I guarantee you they're going to say yes. And so what we're talking about is not fluff. It's critical and central, and ultimately it's what everybody wants. But they don't know how to do it. And in the book, in the opening, I start with the lies of happiness. Like, more of something will make you happier. And I have a #1 New York Times best-selling book. Another one's not going to make me happier. That ultimately happiness is in the little things that happen day in and day out. That hedonism is the enemy of happiness because it wears out your pleasure centers.
So that's hedonic adaptation. So the brain is, like you just said, you already hit #1 New York Times. There isn't like a number above 1 unless you're just like, I want all of them. I want all the spots, and some people think like that, and you've seen this, and I know that I've seen this as well. When folks, they win the championship or they achieve that highest level in whatever it is that they're doing, and then they sink. They kind of lose themselves. And it's because the brain gets acclimated to that high. Even the pleasure things that we seek today, I would imagine, like if we're, whether people are utilizing technology or porn or whatever the case might be, you constantly need more and more and more to have that same level of normalcy, in a sense. Is that accurate?
Well, there's an area in their brain. So there's a neuroscience of happiness. And the area in your brain that feels pleasure is called the nucleus accumbens. And it responds to a number of neurotransmitters, but primarily dopamine. And when dopamine hits it, you go, oh, I like that. But if it hits it too strong, cocaine, or too often, addiction, it wears it out. And then you need to engage in that behavior, not to feel high, but to feel okay. And this is why fame is a disaster for the brain. And I've been blessed. I'm in Justin Bieber's docuseries Seasons to be his doctor, and Miley Cyrus, and I adore these kids. But what happened to them is just a disaster for brain function, that they get so much cool stuff, right, from money and drugs and
Notoriety.
fame and notoriety and anything they want, but doesn't make them happy. In fact, it makes them sad. And they don't know that we have to protect them rather than, like Justin was on tour and he had to end it early because everything around the fame was then making it worse. So not sleeping, overworking, video games, bad food, drugs, all the girl, it's like everything to wear out that part of your brain. And you just end up feeling awful. And people go, but you have everything, but not a healthy brain.
Yeah, that's powerful. So the neuroscience, so what would a healthy brain look like from a neuroscience perspective?
So I did a study for this book where I gave 500 consecutive patients to Amen Clinics the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire. And then I scanned them. because that's what we do at AMM Clinics. I now have 10 clinics around the country. And we looked at people at high happiness scores versus low happiness scores. And you had better frontal lobe function if you were in the high happiness group. And you had low frontal lobe function in the low happiness group, which means don't let children hit soccer balls with their foreheads. That's a really bad idea. Marijuana is not a health food because it drops blood flow to the brain. Alcohol is not a health food because it drops blood flow. And if you have low blood flow to your front part of your brain, you end up making impulsive decisions that damage your relationship, less happiness.
Oh man. So these exposures, so the prefrontal cortex is going to be more correlated with happiness? Is that what I'm hearing?
Good activity
Good
in
activity.
the prefrontal cortex is associated with happiness, and low activity is associated with depression.
Because I watched this over my 38-year career, going from funnily enough, in the early 80s, where we thought the brain couldn't change, we had a better approach with mental health than we have now, where we know the brain can change. And I did some of the first neuroplasticity research in the world in my field in the 80s. And that was that time when I was told it was ridiculous. And it was only the mid-90s that people actually accepted that the brain could change. So it just shows you how recent it is. And so clinically, it's affected how people practice. So I've watched people going from having a holistic approach, looking at the person in context, their whole story, if someone's battling with whatever they're battling with, and also separating out things like, kind of looking at the whole person. So if you're battling with learning and you're battling with emotions, what happened? Not just lumping a label on because of the symptom. It was never, oh, you're battling with learning, you're battling with behavioral issues, and you're feeling very depressed. Okay, so you're clinically depressed, you have a learning disability, here's the medication. That's today. Then it was a narrative of, okay, well, let's look at the whole story. Let's bring in the whole team. What happened to you? How can we address that backstory? And that changed over the last 38 years with the advances of our understanding of the human brain, which we needed. With the advances in brain science, technology, medicine, this has taken us leaps into the future. But we paid a huge price, and I talk about that in the book too. And that huge price is that we've forgotten about the narrative of the person. And there's very few clinicians and people in the field, and I mean, Daniel, and myself and a few others are like, there's honestly, there's more now. But at one stage, there was, the going belief is that if you have depression, it's considered something like diabetes, and there's a chemical imbalance. And I mean, none of this is scientific. None of it's been proven. All of it is looking for some sort of neurobiological correlate that caused this depression. So it's like you've got this brain disease, and that's why you're depressed. No, you don't have a brain disease and that's making you depressed. You can have one and that can contribute, and there could be a tumor or something like that. But your mind is the overarching concept here. So you're a person who's experienced maybe trauma or abuse or whatever it may be, or COVID and grief and loss and financial. So when we're feeling mental health challenges, those are not illnesses. They are actually responses, and they are symptoms of an underlying issue, and they're warning signals that we need to listen to. And if we don't listen to them and we just stick a label on, and people take that on as their identity, it changes the brain, it changes the body, and I'll show you how in a moment. But what essentially that does is in the context of psychology and in population statistics and what happens to humanity is when you ignore a person's story and you don't allow a person to express and find the cause and the origin, what you do is remove a whole component of a person's functioning. You literally ignore 90% of how they're functioning. You focus just on the biological, which works great if you've got heart disease or something physically wrong with your body. But when we've got a story in our life, which all of us do have, we have to focus on that. So we see what we saw happening from the mid-90s when neuroplasticity was at its sort of accepted and growing. We saw that leap in medicine, technology, neuroscience. We saw a backward movement, however, in mind. So people then started cutting out the story of mind and saying, well, that's we can't really measure it. So let's focus just on the biology. Let's make everything about the biology of the brain, and it's brain, 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 and forget all about the experience. And that has resulted in a current trend that people don't talk about enough, but it's called deaths of despair. And what is happening now in our current age in 2021, and it started in 96 and it peaked, it was really identified between 14 and 15, and it's a massive problem currently, and that is that people are dying 8 to 25 years younger than they should from preventable lifestyle diseases and disorders. And that's tracked back to the mid-90s. So what I'm saying in total here is that for decades we've been improving the trend of people living longer. For decades people have been living longer because of advances, but that reversed in the mid-90s, and by the mid-2000s it was solid in science. So people are dying younger than they should with advances. There's a paradox, and we have to ask ourselves, how can that happen? It's contradictory. It doesn't work, but it is. And it's happening because of preventable stuff, preventable lifestyle diseases. So when we think of lifestyle, we think of food and diet and exercise, and stress management, and it's kind of a little category popped in there. But actually each one of those things is driven by mind. So we've got to relook at the whole concept. It's not that mind is just part of a list of things. Mind is driving all those things. Your mind never stops for 3 seconds. We can go without food for 3 weeks. We can go without water for 3 days. We can go without oxygen for 3 minutes. We don't even go 3 seconds without our mind working. Your mind is the source of everything. So your mind is the source of what you choose to eat and the nutritional benefit you get from what you're eating. You can lose up to 80% of the nutritional benefit just by being in a toxic, unforgiving, or bitter or angry state, which affects your pancreas, for example, and it doesn't secrete neuropeptides that you should have. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. So your mind is driving your digestive system. Your mind drives the benefit that you get down to the level of your DNA out of exercise. Your mind is driving how you manage that next argument, that next podcast, that next interaction, that response to the news. Your mind is always working. So if we don't deal with mind, or we eliminate mind and just try and label people from a symptom, we are going to land up with what we have, people dying younger than they should. And mankind advancing with technology, but going backwards with who we are as humans. So in conclusion to that question was a long answer. When you identify with, if someone says you have clinical depression from a list of symptoms, and they diagnose, so symptom, 15 minutes, diagnosis, label, medication, or maybe a bit of therapy, or maybe a bit of both, you immediately change the way that your brain functions. You start your frontal, I'm just going to give you simple versions. For example, your frontal lobe, as soon as you get that kind of negative label, you get less oxygen and blood flow to the front of your brain, literally immediately. Your identity gets stuck in being in a very negative identity. So that creates imbalance between the two sides of the brain. So identifying with a toxic label that doesn't actually make sense will affect the functionality of your ability to make decisions and think with cognitive flexibility, and right down to the level of impacting intelligence. And I show that in my research. When you actually show a person how to shift their identity and not see themselves as a label. So instead of saying, I am depressed, like that's me, I've got clinical depression, you rather say, to help them to see, empower them to see that, no, you aren't depression, you're experiencing depression, which is totally okay, totally understandable. And if you grab that depression and look at it, you'll find a message in the depression. You are simply responding in a normal way to an adverse circumstance. When you change that, you change everything about the brain, the body, right down to the level of the telomeres.
The number one thing that is disrupting our livelihood, that is keeping people out of work, the number one thing is depression. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, depression is now the leading cause of absenteeism in the United States. The number one cause of missed work is depression. To say that depression has reached epidemic proportions is an understatement. Now, a huge, often overlooked underlying faculty or contributing force behind depression and really all manner of chronic illnesses is stress. And a study that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine, so this is the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine, reported that upwards of 80% of all physician visits today are for stress-related illnesses. All right? Upwards of 80% of the things that people are going to the doctor for are related to stress. Stress is a key contributing factor to those things. And we don't think about that because, again, stress is sort of invisible in many ways. And in reality, stress can cause a whole series of biological and mental breakdowns as well. Now, how does exercise provide a science-backed defense against depression? A brand new meta-analysis published in the BMJ, one of our most prestigious medical journals, the British Medical Journal, looking at the impact of exercise on symptoms of depression versus conventional treatments like drugs and psychotherapy. This meta-analysis included 1,039 randomized controlled trials. All right, so over 1,000 randomized trials were included in this analysis. And this also included nearly 130,000 human beings. And the study revealed that physical activity is 1.5 times more effective at reducing mild to moderate symptoms of depression, psychological stress, and anxiety than medication or psychotherapy. It works better. Over 1,000 randomized controlled trials found that exercise works better. Now, this study has been published for a couple of months now, but yet, why aren't we hearing about this? Why aren't our physicians recommending exercise as a form of treatment? Because to say that it's not science-backed is ridiculous. It's more science-backed than anything. And it's free. It's generally free and accessible, but it's not promoted to provide that benefit so clearly.
It's absolutely true. Even in terms of the rising rate of suicides among all ages, particularly our youth, depression and trauma have become kind of normalized and popular in the atmosphere of the mentality of the world. And so when you look at our culture, the Western world culture, there is a heavy movement around commercialism, around materialism, around gaining, but there's not a real vision about the activation of the potential within us. We don't hear about character anymore. We don't hear about becoming the best version of ourselves unless we're listening to you, unless they're listening to me, or listening to people who are awake. People are reaching outside of themselves to get something to make themselves happy. Again, the consumption. So that leads to a depression rather than an expression. So depression means that something's not being expressed. So just in terms of long-term healing, the studies that I've seen is that, if a person walks around, if a person hydrates, if a person begins to stimulate their mind with a vision, then something begins to change within, not only chemically, but mentally. Their focus becomes, I'm not trying to get famous. I'm not trying to get likes. I'm not trying to be known on Facebook. I'm not trying to get something out there that's going to fill me up. I have something, and I want to express that. That's creativity. It's beyond just mere creation. It's actually, I'm tapping into something within me that I want to express. That leads to a greater sense of happiness, a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of joy, a greater sense of being available to inspiration, you see. And so I think, when was the last time you heard a political leader or a leader stand up and say, we have to garner our country to have a vision of what can be possible? Generally, our leaders will stand up and they're always against something. They're gonna fight a virus. They're gonna fight another country. They're gonna add more nuclear weapons. They're gonna do something that's gonna augment fear within the population, rather than focus an individual towards a vision of possibility, a vision of peace, a vision of community, a vision of working together. So kids growing up, and all they're hearing is what they are to be afraid of. That's all they hear. They go to school. We got to get them to the table. It's going to be a mass shooting. Here's how you get out if a mass shooter comes in. Here's the next disease you might get. If that's all they're hearing, then that leads to a kind of a depression of energy. You take a child I've met your kids, so I know you do this consciously or unconsciously, and you speak to their potential, you speak to their possibility, you speak to the greatness within them on a regular basis.
Yeah.
They start to rise up differently than kids growing up with everything you can be afraid of. Now, of course, you have to teach your kids not to run in front of a car. If a car is coming, there are certain basic things. Don't touch the oven if it's hot. Yeah. But if that's their only message, that there's something bad out there and it's going to get you, then there's a curtailing of creativity and hearing the inspirational broadcast that's happening everywhere throughout the universe. So depression is a lack of expression. That's how I kind of frame it.
The gut and brain are formed from the same fetal tissue. So when babies are growing in their mother's womb, they're formed from that same fetal tissue, and they are inextricably linked for the rest of our life through what's known as the gut-brain axis, or the connection between the two. We know 95% of serotonin is made in the gut, stored in the gut. 50% of dopamine is made in the gut and stored in the gut. These sort of feel-good, pleasure, happy neurotransmitters. And that's just one aspect of it. Then you think about 75% of the immune system's in the gut. Inflammation's a product of the immune system. So most issues with the brain have to do with inflammation. So both from a neurotransmitter synthesis standpoint and the crosstalk between the gut microbiomes and the brain and the metabolites they produce to do so, to the inflammatory component. I mean, there's a whole field of research known as the cytokine model of cognitive function. Cytokines are pro-inflammatory cells. How does inflammation impact how our brain works? How does inflammation impact mental health? And that's this book is born out of what I get to talk to people on an hourly basis. And I just know there's a massive sea of people that are falling through the cracks of conventional medicine, doing everything their doctor's telling them to do, and they're considered treatment resistant, right? And they are left to be their own doctor, their own health advocate in many ways. And I think, I'm sure you agree with this, I'm happy that we are normalizing the conversations around mental health and mental health care. I'm happy that we're normalizing the conversations even around autoimmunity. But in many ways, in the conventional mainstream world, it's, in my opinion, incomplete conversation. Because you really can't talk about mental health until you realize that mental health is physical health. Yeah. And our brain is a part of our body just as much as anything else. And we like to relegate mental health as sort of this abstract, quote unquote, chemical imbalance, which is flimsy science anyways, but to really ignore the inflammatory component and ignore the gut-brain axis component largely, these people are left to fend for themselves.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because mental health and brain health are really synonymous.
Yeah.
But, it seems very ethereal. It seems kind of abstract when we talk about mental health.
Yeah.
But in reality, again, this is all of our thoughts create chemistry. And you just mentioned something so profound, which is so much of our mood altering chemistry is located in our gut, right? And so we have this perception, again, like all of our stuff is happening up here in our heads.
Yeah.
And I think this is a result of, obviously our senses being up here, but, the gut has been called the second brain, the enteric nervous system. You just mentioned serotonin and dopamine and, there's so much more. Melatonin is a huge hub happening in your gut. You have these enterochromaffin cells. And so what we're putting into our gut inherently is going to affect our mood, our perception, our mental health, right? And just to open this door for everybody, why is food foundational in this gut-brain communication?
Well, it's the entry point. I mean, hopefully we're all eating, right? So I think it's a way for people to realize they will influence how their neurotransmitters are expressed. How will their brain be firing? How will their brain be functioning? Will it be well balanced? Will it be communicating properly with the rest of the body or not? And every food we eat either feeds inflammation or fights it. Some in negligible ways, and you're not going to notice it. Don't stress about it. But there are significant players when it comes to your breakfast, lunch, and dinner and your snacks that will do one or the other for you. So yeah, we have to start there. The food's a central part of the book, but then again, what I call these metaphysical meals, right? These things that I want people to start shifting their perspective on, like, what are the thoughts they're feeding themselves? That's a meal. But that's less prescriptive and more nebulous, because it's easy for me to say all the clinical nutrition stuff in the book and show the science and have these foods are most likely to mess up your mood and raise inflammation or trigger an autoimmune issue. These foods are going to nourish the microbiome and calm things down. It's a lot more to unpack. It's a bigger, complex topic to talk about. Feeding, what thoughts are we feeding our body? But it's the truth. We have to start retraining our brain and retraining our habits to start to be supportive of the parasympathetic, the resting, the digesting, the hormone balanced with these quote unquote metaphysical meals. So things like meditation, things like breath work, things like somatic experiences can start to shift the nervous system in a more of a resting, digesting, hormone balanced way, which is to me just as influential as the foods that we eat. So again, to be a both and approach is important.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes from the book is, thoughts and emotions are like nutrients for your head, heart, and soul. And unfortunately, many of us have been feeding ourselves junk food for a long, long time. Unquote. Yeah. So this is speaking to the junk thoughts that we might habitually be feeding ourselves, right? My friend Daniel Amen calls them ants, right? Automatic negative thoughts. Yeah. And we get into these negative loops. And my argument, would just say, like, my old self hearing this message from you would be like, this doesn't make sense when we're talking about your thoughts affecting your biology, your metabolism, because how is this influencing your health outcomes if your thoughts don't have any calories? You know what I mean? Like, it just, because it's apparently something not tangible, which even that's the thing about today. You just mentioned, like, we have solid science on this. Your thoughts, they have a physical substance. It's a creation, truly. But I think that our mission today is to get people past that veil and appreciate the fact that we can think ourselves into better health, but we have to address kind of the underlying milieu, the underlying mess that we find ourselves in.
I agree with you fully. And I think for many people, at least that I've seen over the years, when they start feeding themselves these healthy metaphysical meals, these nourishing thoughts and habits that will start to cultivate more of a parasympathetic state, they tend to want to go towards the foods that love them back too, because it's kind of like they have more of a self-respect. And it's not that they're trying to diet and shame themselves into wellness. It's like, no, they start to love feeling great more than they thought they wanted that food that didn't love them back. And that's sort of the paradigm shift. But look, some people, the entry point for them to start reclaiming their health is the food. And then at some point, I see that bandwidth increase, that resilience increase, because they maybe cleaned up their diet, they worked on healing their gut. Then they're, okay, this meditation stuff, this breathwork stuff, this somatic stuff, I can handle it now. So again, to deal with both the gut and the feelings and meet yourself where you're at, it's okay. But at some point in your journey, most people are going to have to deal with both sides of this coin, the physiological and the mental, emotional, spiritual.
It becomes a cycle. It becomes a cycle of eating those foods, having less space to make better choices. And we get into the cycle of cravings that people will talk about. We know that sugar is associated with the dopamine reward pathways that street drugs are, like cocaine. So we know that when people speak about a strong term like sugar addiction, it actually has some scientific basis to it. So with PTSD, you're already struggling with an overload of things on your brain, and you have less capacity to make those healthier choices. So how do we walk ourselves back from that, and how do we break that path? Certainly therapy, certainly other forms of treatment become important, but food is also something we can deal with in that instance.
All right, now I'm going to bring up something that might have got skipped over there. You mentioned cocaine, all right, and this pathway being very similar with sugar. And I think a rational argument would come up is that, like, nobody's like selling their furniture to get sugar, or like selling their, out selling their body or something.
Right.
But in reality, it's because sugar is so easily accessible and socially acceptable. Yeah. And there's a really famous study that was done on rats, giving them the option of choosing between sugar water or cocaine. And rats that were even addicted to cocaine soon shifted over their addiction to the sweetened beverage. It's so bananas.
It is not only crazy, it is in our food everywhere. And I think that this is something where we have to educate ourselves. You know, the power of nutrition becomes, as you talk about, really important to us, because people don't realize there's an organization out of Boston that has listed upwards of 250 other names for sugar on food labels. So a couple of things about this. People don't realize that something simple like brown rice syrup is actually sugar, because brown rice is associated with a more complex carb. Maybe people are encouraged to eat that over other forms of rice. But people also don't realize from food labels that because our food labels are in grams and not ounces and pounds, which is how all our cookbooks are standardized in the United States, they don't know how to convert it. So 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon. So if you start to convert that, you realize on a package, on a food that you're eating, the amount of sugar you're consuming. And sugar taps into that dopamine reward pathway. And that's, in fact, how we start to crave it more.
This is so important. And, you know, again, we're talking about solutions today, but another absolutely massive issue specifically affecting our children right now is ADHD. And so if you could, can you share just how long you've been in this field, and could you share what you've seen over the span of your career with rates of ADHD? Has this been going up from what you've been seeing firsthand?
It actually has. So I've been in this, I've been a psychiatrist for just over 2 decades now. And I will tell you that prescriptions in both children and adults are precipitously higher for ADHD. I would say in the last decade or so that I've noticed. Early on in my career, yes, it was important. Yes, it existed. But now I'm finding that more adults are coming in with problems, but also children. But it's just sort of, I feel like it's everywhere. And I know that's a gross exaggeration, but I feel like that's what's going on in the clinical world. And I am a nutritional psychiatrist, so I probably take everything back to food. But the truth is, our food system has changed. You know, what we're eating has changed. Eating a diet of Pop-Tarts and cereal is going to impact your brain development. So we have to make that connection that food is impacting the brain development of children. And I can't ignore that fact when prescription rates are going up for things like ADHD. So I feel like taking a step back from that and rethinking what we're doing from early on is going to affect the brain development of children. Of course, there are genetic, environmental factors, so many different things. Not every child has the same access to food, or same access to food or same access to healthy food. So all of that becomes important, but I think our messaging has to be different in terms of our own understanding, because I think that that's where the power lies. Food labels are not necessarily going to change, Shawn. No one else is from the outside is going to tell us, but I think we need to empower ourselves to help our own families, help our kids, help our generations that are after us or before us.
Yeah, so we can do it.
Yeah.
Let's dive in and talk about some specifics here with this one. What are some of the specific foods that can trigger or contribute to symptoms of ADHD?
Sure. So, one of the things to think about with ADHD is those processed, ultra-processed foods, the colorants, stabilizers, all of those things. The ultra-processed ingredients in those foods are just not good for brain development. So that's a big one, because I think that it excludes a lot of sort of school-age snacks and things like that. Omega-3 fatty acids, hugely important in many different mental health conditions, including ADHD, including cognitive disorders, but also depression and anxiety. And we get them from things like wild sockeye salmon, fatty fish, sardines, anchovies, but you also get plant-based sources. You do get the short-chain ALAs in plant-based sources, so there is a little bit of an issue around availability and the conversion, because it's not as efficient as the omega-3 fatty acids in things like in fatty fish. But you can get sources in walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds, sea vegetables. We know that they exist there, and we know that they are important. So consuming them becomes important. A lot of people say, well, can I take a supplement? you can't out supplement a healthy diet. So start with food first, and then if you're talking to your doctor and you need that supplement, absolutely. But these are powerful tools in sort of the armor that we need for our mental well-being.
Brain reserve is the extra tissue and function you have, brain tissue, brain function, to deal with whatever stress comes your way. I was an Army psychiatrist for 7 years, and I realized, put 2 soldiers in a tank, expose them to the same blast, the same force, the same angles. One of them walks away unharmed. Another person is permanently disabled. Why? It depended on the brain reserve or the brain health they brought into the accident. And brain reserve is happening throughout our whole life. And even before we're born, it's the health of the mother, it's the health of the father. So parents who smoked as teenagers, their children have less reserve. Parents who are under great stress when their mothers, when they're pregnant with a child, that child is born with less reserve. Parents who are smoking pot, in Durango, Colorado, the incidence of babies born with marijuana is up 1,700%. It's horrifying that baby's going to have less reserve. And then it depends on what happens throughout your life. Those of us that played football, we're stealing our reserve. I had no clue, but stealing our reserve. Those of us that grew up on fast food, less reserve. Those of us that grew up in houses of high adverse childhood experiences, stealing our reserve. Those of us that grew up with parents who cared, parents who paid attention, parents who read with us every night, more reserve. And so every day, and it happens throughout your whole life, every day you're building reserve, money in the bank for brain health, or you're stealing reserve. And if you go to bed a half an hour early, you're building reserve. If you decide to stay up and, I'm just going to finish this series on Netflix, and you go to bed at 1 o'clock and you have to be up at 5, you just stole a whole bunch of reserve, because you know this, when you don't sleep properly, it turns off 700 health promoting genes, which means trash begins to build up in your brain and it steals reserve.
Why are relationships such a huge influence on our health and longevity?
Yeah. The research is still going on, but we've spent the last 10 years in our study trying to answer that question. The best thing we can say now, the best hypothesis with some good data, is that it's about stress, that good relationships seem to be stress relievers. And I'll explain. So, when something happens to us, you have a really upsetting thing happen during your day, you get a ticket, or some medical crisis happens, you can literally feel your body change. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. It's called fight or flight mode. And we want our bodies to respond that way. But then when the threat is removed, we want our bodies to come back to baseline. And one of the things you'll notice is that, if you have something upsetting happen in your day and, you're thinking about it and you're upset about it, if you have somebody at the end of the day you can talk to about that, and you're able to talk to them, you can literally feel your body calm down and go back to that equilibrium. What if you don't have anybody you can talk to like that? And so we think what happens is that people who are more isolated, lonely, less connected, that those people stay in a kind of low-level fight or flight mode of chronic stress, higher levels of stress hormones circulating in their bodies, higher levels of inflammation all the time, breaking down body systems slowly but gradually. And so that's what we think is one of the main drivers of how relationships can either improve our health or the lack of good relationships can break it down.
That's so remarkable. And the thing is, even as you're saying this, it just experientially we know this, but to have the science to affirm it and to direct our attention to it, it's basically a buffer. It's a very powerful buffer against how we're processing and dealing with stress. And we'll put the study up for everybody to see on the screen, but an analysis recently found that upwards of 60 to 80% of all physician visits today are for stress-related illnesses.
Absolutely.
Right? Stress is tied into so many different things that can go wrong in the human body. But and just to be clear as well, it's not the absence of stress, because stress can get turned into a bad word as well, right? But it's our ability to properly assimilate, manage, grow from stress, hormetic stressors. You mentioned exercise and things like that. But overall, when we get into this place of chronic stress and not being able to deal with the stress,
right?
And so our relationships basically make us stronger in the face of stress.
Yeah, exactly. And what we hope is, as you say, that we have the chance to recover from stress, and also that we're not overwhelmed by challenges. That if we have challenges that we feel capable of meeting, that's great, and that fosters growth. If we have challenges that are overwhelming, we don't have ways of coping, and that's when stress becomes detrimental to our bodies. Relationships and connections keep us wanting to be our best selves in the world. I mean, one of the things they often find is that men in particular are more likely to die shortly after their partners die. And the question is, why does that happen? Is it mystical? And one of the simpler explanations is that men often, as they're older, stop taking their medication. They stop eating as well because they don't have a partner there to say, did you take your pills today? They don't have a partner there to make sure they're eating decent food, right? And they're remembering to eat, right? And they're not drinking too much. And so in some ways, these connections in the most simple fashion keep us trying to be our best for each other.
Yeah. And in the context of men, I would think also that sense of purpose as well, living for her, providing service. But I would imagine obviously it's going to affect everybody.
Everybody, women too, absolutely. That part of what happens is we all want to feel like we matter somewhere in the world, right? And often the place we feel like we matter first is with each other, with our closest relationships. So what happens when the person you're closest to is not there anymore? And when we're lucky, we find new people to whom we can matter and they can matter to us.
Yeah. Now, here's the biggest question, right? We know that our relationships obviously have a huge influence on our lives, but I think we have this very romantic idea about relationships. You complete me and the whole thing, you know.
Yeah.
But what actually constitutes a good relationship? And I think it's going to be surprising for people because we think super smooth sailing, no problems.
No. In fact, we found that like many of our most stable couples fought like cats and dogs. But the difference, so it wasn't the amount of arguing you did. It wasn't even the amount of anger. What it was, when we actually watched couples on video having an argument, it was whether you could see a bedrock of affection and respect, even when people were arguing. So what we know about the best relationships is, first of all, there are always disagreements, always. And the question is, how do we manage those disagreements? Can we find ways to work out those inevitable conflicts? I want this and you want that. Always going to happen. The question is, can we find a way to work things out so that neither of us feels like we've won or lost, that we both feel okay about each other and ourselves when we emerge from working out a conflict? That's the key, not whether disagreements happen, because those are always going to happen.
In the book, you also talk about some of the myths about happiness. And one of those is that happiness is an accomplishment, essentially. It's something that we can basically achieve like a certificate or something. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yes. This idea that, if I just get these things in my life, if I buy the right stuff, right? If I get the right partner, if I live in the right place, that each of those things will somehow set me up for good. The truth is, happiness comes and goes for all of us. Nobody is happy all the time. And it's really important to name that, because when we look at somebody else's Instagram feed, for example, we can think they're having the best life ever. They've got it all figured out and they're happy all the time. Because we curate what we show each other. Yeah. You know, I don't post the pictures of myself when I wake up in the morning feeling depressed or dreading the future. I post the pictures where I'm happy and I'm in a nice place. And so what we want to do is be much more aware of the ways that we compare our insides to other people's outsides.
If we think about our inner worlds, our thoughts, you know, we might have thoughts about, I'm not good enough, or there's no point in trying. We might have emotions, and we have, you know, many different emotions that course through our worlds every day. Emotions, experiences like stress or disappointment, joy, anxiety, and so on. And we also have our stories. We have stories. Some of them were written on our mental chalkboards when we were 5 years old. Stories about whether we are good enough, what kind of life we deserve, what kind of love we deserve. And as it turns out, how we deal with our inner worlds does drive everything. It drives how we love, how we come to our relationships, what we share, whether we're able to be vulnerable. It drives how we parent, the way we are able to show up to our children and to help them to navigate their own emotions. It drives how we lead in our organizations and beyond. And of course, it drives our health and our well-being, because as an example, when we come home from work, if we are feeling stressed and we are unable to recognize that that stress is about something that happened in the workplace that day, and so we push it down, or we're not able to deal with it effectively, that then we know impacts on our likelihood that we'll sit in front of the TV, as an example, as opposed to making effective choices. So much in our society suggests that it's all about externalities. You know, that if we if we structure the environment right, it's almost this idea that, yes, you know, if we don't like our house, we can paint the walls. If we don't like our car, we can change it. And there's almost this idea that we can change anything by changing externalities. Whereas actually so much of the kind of life that we have, the kind of love that we have, and the choices that we make is driven by the relationship that we have with ourselves. Now, just to be clear, that's not to say that the external world doesn't matter. We know that systems and policies make a difference. We know that if we live in a community in which we are served by public transport and it takes 2 hours to get to and from work, that's going to impact on our lives, you know, and to deny that would be denying reality. So we know that systems and processes make a difference. We also know that we can set up our immediate environment in ways that are congruent with choices that we want. So for example, you know, the simplest, most obvious example is if you're trying to make effective health choices and you go into the kitchen and there's no fruit, but there is chocolate, well, you know, your environment is nudging you in a particular direction. But ultimately, the way we navigate our inner world, our ability to be healthy with ourselves, with our emotions, to be connected with our values and who we want to be, this has a outsized impact on everything else. And in many ways, these ideas of emotions and inner world have historically been pushed to the sidelines. And so, Shawn, I know you speak to a lot of psychologists and you do a lot of work in the area of psychology, but I'll share with you that when I was doing my PhD in emotions and I was in a psychology department, I struggled to find an advisor who was willing to supervise me, to supervise my research in the area of emotions. Because even in a psychology department 20 years ago, the idea was that actually it's about what you can measure, it's about externalities, it's about maybe behaviors, but the whole idea of emotions was seen as being soft, fluffy, intangible. We see this in our organizations where emotions have become feminized and pushed to the sidelines. And one of the things that I'm most excited about of my work and the world we're in right now is there's a radical reawakening and a radical reckoning with this acknowledgement that emotions shape our thinking, our decision making, and our behaviors. And they are probably the most powerful resource that we can have. The other that I just wanted to connect with briefly, because I think it's so important, is you mentioned this idea about sometimes what happens is the emotion or the experience becomes our identity. And I think this is really powerful. And I'll give you an example of what I mean here, which is words matter. Words matter. So often we'll say something like, I am sad. Okay, I am sad. I am angry. And it's so commonplace. We all do this all the time. Like, I am sad. Of course, like, what else would I be saying? But if we think about it, when we say I am sad, what we are actually saying is, I am all of me, 100% of me is defined by sadness. And so, Shawn, one of the things that I speak about a lot in my work is about the fact that all of us, every single person listening today, we all have beauty and wisdom and compassion and capacity and values and intentions. You know, in the dark of night, when we aren't in a swirl of anxiety, but rather we kind of get into bed and we are just alone with ourselves, and we kind of tap into the core of who we are as individuals. Every single one of us has values and like this kind of deep voice inside of ourselves that is really what I want to think of as our human wisdom. And when we say something like, I am sad, there's no space for anything else. There's no space. If I am angry with my partner or with my spouse, if that emotion is all enveloping, there's no space for who do I want to be in this interaction? Who do I want to be in this relationship? What are my values right now? Yes, I'm angry with this person, but what is the greater goal of how I want to come to this relationship? And so I often think that when we say I am sad, it's almost like what we are doing is we are saying almost that sadness is a cloud in the sky and we have become the cloud. And what I like to think instead is that there's huge power in naming our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories for what they are. They are thoughts, emotions, and stories. They aren't fact. They aren't our identity. They are thoughts, emotions, and stories. So they are part of us, but they are not all of us. And the way we start getting this beautiful separation so that other aspects of ourselves can come to the fore is when we start noticing them for what they are. And this is what you were reflecting on earlier. I'm noticing that I'm feeling sad. I'm noticing the urge to shut down in this conversation. I'm noticing the thought that there's no point in trying. I'm noticing that this is my I'm not good enough story. When you start to notice your thoughts, your emotions, and stories for what they are, which is thoughts, emotions, and stories, parts of us, but not all of us, what we start doing is we start creating space for other aspects of ourselves to come forward. And so what we're doing when we do this is we move away from I am sad, I am the cloud, into recognizing that you're not the cloud, that every single person listening, you are not the cloud. You are the sky. You are the sky. You are human and messy and able and big enough and capacious and beautiful enough to experience all of your thoughts, your emotions, and your stories, and to still choose who you want to be in this space, in this moment. You aren't defined. You know, when you look at the sky, you don't look at a cloud and define the sky by the single cloud. And emotional agility is about moving into the space of being the sky.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
About a quarter of the UK population have this parasite called blastocystis. And it turns out it's associated with good health. And if you've got this parasite, you have less internal fat, you have less obesity,